Is there evidence to suggest that artificial blue light makes you fat and depressed?
The answer is that the blue light that comes out of our LEDs that are almost the predominant form of lighting today contains blue, which, yes, causes increased obesity, increased depression, and a host of other problems.
So what are the mechanisms behind that? How does it make you obese and how does it cause depression? Because I know that with blue light, it does increase blood sugar. So it's as if you're snacking without putting anything in your mouth.
Right. The mechanisms are really, it's what we've learned about human physiology, human design. What we now know, and this has really been unraveled over the last 20 years, we now know that there are blue detectors in the eye, which specifically detect sky blue light. Now, you might say, well, isn't what my lights are white or yellowish, but in fact, the what the eye is seeing is all the colors of the rainbow that are in a light that are in our brain we see as white, but in fact, it contains every color of the rainbow. It turns out that it is the blue wavelengths in that light, the blue component in white light, that is during the day telling us it's daytime, during the night telling us it's nighttime. And as long as we're out in the natural world, that worked very well because there's plenty of blue in the natural daylight. Whether or not it's a cloudy day, there's lots of blue and other colors of the rainbow in that light. But during the nighttime hours, there's virtually no blue reaches our eyes. And even in the old days when people had campfire, wood fires, and candles, they contain extremely low levels of blue. But we have, in the interest of so-called energy efficiency, and we can explain why it isn't very energy efficient, we've adopted these LEDs that pump blue light. And so during the evening hours, unless you're sitting in an environment like you are right now, Jonas, where you've removed the blue, most normal LEDs on the shelves will dose you with that blue. It's detected by these eye detectors in cells in the eye. They've got a long and fancy name called the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, or IPRGCs. And those cells in the eye are detecting this blue. They send a message back to the circadian clock, the master circadian clock in the brain, an area in the base of the brain in the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN for short. And in turn, that sends a message to the pineal and to other systems throughout the body. And the pineal then, if there's no blue, will produce melatonin during the nighttime hours to pass on the signal to all the cells of the body and all the multiple circadian clocks we have throughout our body that it is dark outside. So we've got a very well-tuned natural mechanism to keep our bodies and our metabolism and our health synchronized to natural daylight. But nowadays we live 90% of the time indoors, and as a result, and use these LED lights in the evening. And as a result, we totally confuse our body clock systems and everything. And that is that disruption of our circadian clocks, of our circadian rhythms, the 24-hour rhythms in virtually every function of our body. The result of that disruption is increased rates of obesity, diabetes, of heart disease, of various cancers, of depression, and the like.
People think of blue light as something that disrupts your sleep, screens disrupting your sleep, because, well, some in that group might understand that uh, blue light suppresses melatonin. But I was, specifically, I am personally very interested in the fact that it increases blood sugar. And I've seen studies that show that blue light is, at night really increases the risk of diabetes and obesity as well. So if you could talk more about that, that would be really interesting.
Well, let me just tell you one of the studies we did. We took a group of perfectly normal, healthy people, non-diabetic, young and healthy people, and put them in a room at night with lights that were either the standard LEDs you buy off the shelf or lights that contain no blue in them. at the same brightness. So the brightness was the same. The only difference was the lights either contained blue or not blue. When we did that, by the end of the night, these people had glucose tests, glucose tolerance tests, which is the standard test for diabetes, showing that they actually were in a diabetic range. In other words, we produced a diabetic response just because we shone lights that were rich in blue. When we shone lights that on them, they're just regular room lighting, but it had no blue in it because we'd taken the blue out and specially engineered lights, then that glucose response didn't happen. The second thing that happened was they got much hungrier when they were under the blue light. And in fact, people who work night shifts under blue-rich LED light, the standard LED lights, snack twice as much as people who are under lights that don't contain blue. So we've got two mechanisms going on. Number one, the appetite centers are triggered by blue light. And number two, the way the body metabolizes is changed so that we are, as I say, rendered into a diabetic state. So that's one of the key things that's happening. And it's a very interesting one. It's not just, I mean, I think it's very important, Jones, as you're bringing up. It's not just a sleep issue, this, because people tend to get focused on the sleep issue. It's far more substantial than that. And in fact, it affects many, many different systems in the body. The immune system, all sorts of things in the body are impaired by that blue-rich light, that artificial light that we are given by all the stores, all the shops, everybody, the installers of lighting fixtures give us these lights, which are really just plain harmful to our health.
I know there are studies that show that blue light increases, or blue light at night, I should say, increases the risk of cancer. Could you go more into that?
Yes. Basically, when you look at the story of breast cancer, for example, you find that it was before electric light was invented, it was a very rare disease. It didn't rank very high at all in what cancers that people would get. Now, of course, it's the leading cause of cancer in women and the leading cause of death in women. And as we looked at the introduction of electric light, and as electric lights were introduced over the course of the last century, what we saw is the rates of breast cancer paralleled the rates of electrification. So in the most brightly lit countries in the world, particularly in northern, in Western Europe, particularly in Belgium, Holland area is one of the most intensely lit areas, urbanized areas, we see breast cancer rates that are 120, 140 women per 100,000 women are getting every year getting breast cancer. In the areas of the world where either before electric lights were invented or where their electricity has not yet reached, places in Africa, for example, the rate is like 20 per 100,000 women. In other words, we've got something in the order of a 7-fold increase in the rate of breast cancer just by in populations that are exposed to electricity. Now, you might say, well, there are other things going on. We've got all these chemical PFAS, the forever chemicals. We've got microplastics, any number of things in our environment today that could be causing it. But another breakthrough study was to show that, in fact, women who've been blind since an early age rarely get breast cancer. They've got all the same chemical exposures. So what we've got, and then furthermore, it's not just these epidemiological studies that show us this. We now know the mechanisms because it's been worked out extremely well in animal studies and human studies, showing that what's happening, one of the key parts of the problem is that when you're exposed to blue-rich light at night, it suppresses your melatonin levels. And melatonin is a key agent in suppressing cancer cells in the body. It has hugely important effects. And when in fact you're exposed to light and you've got suppressed blue-rich light and you've got suppressed melatonin, those cancers grow much more quickly than if you're in blue-free light and your melatonin is at normal levels. So those are the sorts of studies that have been shown now, really strong links. And it's not just breast cancer, it's prostate cancer in men, it's colorectal cancer. And those three cancers are growing rapidly. The rate the incidence rate of those cancers is increasing rapidly. Breast cancer in young women is going up at 4% a year, which is a staggering rate of increase. As the world is switched over from relatively low blue content light, like the old incandescents, which are banned in many countries of the world, including the US and Europe. Once you got rid of those, the halogens, and just only provide people with blue-rich LEDs, then we see these cancer rates climbing. And so there are all many, many threads to say this is a major environmental pollutant, and yet one that is pushed by government regulators. And we can get into why.
Yeah, sure.
So why are government regulators pushing this? Well, there's a big concern. We've got a COP summit going on in Asia right now. And that COP summit, of course, is talking about all the great things you can do to try to reduce global warming, which we all are concerned about, and we all want to make sure that we do our best. In the lighting area, they've used an unfortunate metric, an unfortunate measure of whether a light is efficient or not. The one that's used in the lighting industry is called lumens per watt. Now, watt is obviously electricity, and lumens is the output of light, but it's the measurement of the perceived brightness of light. It's not the total light spectrum. In fact, it's only really looking at the yellow and the green content of light. It doesn't look at the blue content, which is associated with your circadian clocks and health. It doesn't look at the red components or the near infrared components. They're associated with health and healing. It doesn't look at any of those other properties of light. It just merely is looking at that. So if you give a bunch of engineers a metric like lumens per watt, and they put rules in to try to drive it as high as possible and feel good about their energy efficiency, what they're really doing is giving us very bright, cheap junk light. It's cheap because it uses less electricity. It's mass produced now, so the cost of these chips is very low, but it's junk and harmful light, and it's just as harmful as junk food. Just like junk food will give you diabetes, junk light will give you diabetes.
Yeah, that's amazing. Um, I usually talk with my parents about this. And recently, my father was changing the light bulb downstairs, and he said, "Oh, now you don't have to turn it off," because I always turn off the light when I go down because I want it to be dark at night, but my parents don't. And he changed the light to something with a Kelvin number that was like, let's say it went from 4000 Kelvin to 2800 Kelvin. It said warm white. And I had just listened to your interview with Dr. Sarah Pugh, and I heard that you said that the kelvins don't necessarily indicate how much blue there is in the light, that it might look warmer, but there's still a lot of blue in it. So, could you give us a Kelvin guide, sort of?
Yes, I mean, this again is we're dealing with a lighting industry that is all about energy efficiency and appearance, the visual appearance of light. What we're talking about here is the non-visual impact, the very important health impacts of light, unhealthy or healthy. And those measures the healthiness of the light, the amount of blue content it has, for example, during the day and during the night, where you want to be high during the day and low at night, is very poor, is not really measured by these metrics that the industry uses. So they use something called Kelvin, which is the color temperature. It's derived from as you heat up an object like an iron bar and it goes from red hot to white hot. Think of that, and it's what temperature is that object when it gives you a particular level of lighting. And so that the color temperature might vary across from the typical color temperature you get like is 2700 Kelvin on the one hand, you might get 6500 Kelvin the other. The comfortable level that people like tends to be 3000 to 4000 Kelvin. But all that changes the blue level not very much. So it's a very poor measure. It's a measure of color. So think about light, that changing color doesn't mean it makes it healthier. Changing the Kelvin doesn't make it healthier. In fact, we were able to build lights that were the same Kelvin number, around 3,300 Kelvin. We built LED chips that were either had 2% blue content or 20% blue content. In other words, at the same Kelvin, you can get tenfold differences in blue content. So the answer is the measures like the Kelvin, which is also called the coordinated color temperature, or CCT, of the light, which is measured in Kelvin, is a very poor measure of the health benefits of the light. We know that other measures they use is CRI, which is the color rendering index, which is how well it mimics the colors of daylight under daylight. Again, those are all to do with the visual and aesthetic features of light. So lighting industry has been almost completely consumed by focusing, as I say, on the aesthetic. They want lighting that looks pretty, beautiful, comfortable looking at, and also cheap and with low rates of lumens per watt. All of those metrics are not the ones you need to be looking at to judge whether a light's going to be healthy or not.
I know that melanopsin is the most sensitive to the sky blue 480 nanometers. I've also heard that green light, so, between, well, I'm not sure, but 500 to 570, something like that, also disrupts or affects the circadian clock. So is this something you've seen in the literature? Green light also being disruptive of the circadian clock?
Well, you're bringing up, first of all, let's for your audience, let's just talk for a moment. I talked about in the eye these blue detectors. I said they were the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, or IPRGCs. What's in those cells at the back of the retina of the eye is this photopigment called melanopsin. That's what it's sitting in the eye. And that is, as you say, exquisitely sensitive to blue. The early studies of this, this has all evolved just in the last 20 years, basically. The early studies, when we looked into this, we found that you could block out the green, all the green, by filtering, by using eyewear that filtered out all the green, and you totally protect melatonin. In other words, the green was not doing anything to suppress melatonin. And yet the early studies had said, yeah, it's a mixture of blues and greens that do this. So we went back and looked at the early studies, and lo and behold, what we found, they were all done in a very artificial circumstance. They took their research volunteers, the people who volunteered to be guinea pigs, as it were, in these studies, and they put them in a room that was pitch dark, and they put, also to be doubly sure, they put blindfolds on them. So they're sitting in the dark in blindfolds for 2 hours. Now, during that time, what the eye does is it becomes dark adapted. That's how you can see much more easily in the dark. You can see under moonlight much more easily and so forth. When your eye, it takes time for your eye to become adapted to dark. And then they took the blindfolds off and shone for a short period of time different colors of the rainbow light. They did a pure yellow, a pure green, a pure blue, a red, and so forth, different colors to map out what the sensitivity was. But what they're doing it is in the dark adapted eye, which is only something we would have when you wake up in the middle of the night in pitch dark room, or in the first few minutes after you wake in the morning. But normally we're fully light adapted. In other words, the eye is fully adjusted to be able to see under bright lighting conditions. And that's how we spend our days. We're fully light adapted all day long. And if you're in regular room lighting or outside in the daytime, you're definitely under, the eye is adapted to the light. So when we did our tests in people who are fully light adapted, we found green was ineffective. It didn't do anything. And what we found was we were able to then map where the sensitivity was, and it mapped perfectly to the sensitivity of melanopsin, to a peak at 480, but it cut off quite sharply before it got down to the green. So that is one of the things that's been a little confusing when you go into the science. Science is iteratively deciphering all this out. Now, since we did that study, a group from Harvard has shone those lights in the individual lights into the dark adapted eye, not just for an hour, but doing it for 6 hours. And lo and behold, they find that the effects of violet light, the effects of green light fade away in the first hour or so. And after that, it's really only the blue light that's effective. And since most of our lives we live under in light adapted state, that's really the lights that we need to manage. So that's why there's a little confusion if you dig into the research literature.
Now, in terms of blue light blocking glasses, now I know that they don't necessarily need to block out 100% green light because that's another advertisement. I know that some of them advertise that they block out all light in all directions. Now, there's this man, or doctor, I should say, called Jack Kruse. He's also pushing the light campaign quite hard, um, and also roasting a bunch of food gurus, as he calls them. And he wears, glasses like these. They look like normal glasses. Light can enter from the sides and from above. And is that because light from the sides and from above don't necessarily affect melanopsin because it's in the back of the eye? So do you sort of understand what I mean?
Yes, I mean the first of all, the where these cells that are blue detecting cells are, the IPRGCs containing the melanopsin, they're actually much more located more heavily in the bottom of the eye. So, if you think of the underside of the eye, they're in the bottom of the eye. So actually, they're most sensitive to light coming from the sky. That's what they're detecting. They're not located in your fovea, which is what you and I are using right now to look at each other, through the camera. We're using that point in the center of our eye, retina, which has got all the cones and the color sensitivity, and that's what we use for vision. So they're much more located in the periphery and down and predominantly in the lower parts of the periphery. So actually, we're more sensitive to overhead lighting than we are to light from computer screens, for example. That's not saying that light from computer screens doesn't make a difference. And certainly, if you put lighting on the floor at night, that enters much less of it, triggers effects from these blue receptors in the eye because of where they're located in the bottom half of the eye. So now, in terms of spectacles, it depends on the design of spectacles and how closely fitting they are and so forth. There's often, if you're outdoors, there's quite a lot of scatter coming, or maybe even indoors, there could be scatter coming from behind you and bouncing off the off the lens. But we could, and so if you want a perfect solution, wear goggles, close fitting goggles, like you were swimming or something with the right lenses, then you can block it all out. But in fact, you can get a pretty good effect by just eyewear, normally fitting eyewear, because you're trying to deal with the majority of the light that's coming, particularly from above.
Interesting. That's going to be very, very useful to the viewer. Um, so I guess those goggles aren't a marketing gimmick. That was actually true.
Yeah, well,
Um,
the goggles, for the research purposes, you get the perfect clean result. So when you put people with goggles with blue block that block all the blue, but they don't block, the cutoff is around 500 or so, right? Or 490, 500. When they cut off all light, and by the way, just so for your viewers to make sure we're all on the same page, we sort of, when we talk about the colors of the rainbow, we go from about 380, which is deep violet, is a visible light, but still deep violet, all the way up to 780, which is deep red, just before you get to infrared, invisible infrared. That range then enables us to put a number on every light wavelength that we can talk about. So when we're talking about violet light, we're talking about light that goes up to about 420, 25, somewhere around there. We talk about blue light going from about 425 up to about 500 or close to 500, but we have many different colors of blue in the mix. So that basically, if you look at a violet blue, it's down in the 430s. A royal blue is in the 440s. You have, and in each of those had different biological effects, every one of these colors. Sky blue, which is around 480, is where the most sensitive part for the circadian clock is. We have aqua around 490, and then we go into the green. So, all the way across, we can define the color by these nanometer ranges. So basically, it matters if you block out all light below around 490, in other words, block out all the blue and violet, and you use goggles, then it's like you were in pitch darkness, the same effect. In other words, melatonin goes back to the total darkness level. There's no light getting in, but the green is getting in, and the green's doing nothing, which is part of this reason why we got a bit of a confusion in some of the measurements now of this. So the most important thing is now, one other thing I should say before we leave the issue of eyewear. There are a lot of people out there, companies out there selling blue blocking glasses that are absolutely useless because they're blocking totally the wrong blue. They may be blocking the violet. A lot of them block just the violet blue or the royal blue colors. They don't block the 480 at all, which is ridiculous if you think about the circadian clock, because that's where the part you want to block is. So when you go to your optician and they want to charge you an extra 200 euros to put in a blue coating, and that blue coating looks like a nice, you see a little blue reflecting back in the glasses. It's actually quite decorative in looking. Bear in mind that coating, and it comes to the largest lighting companies sell this, make a big profit on it. It does absolutely nothing to protect your circadian clock. Besides, why would someone want to have in their regular eyewear that they use during the daytime a blue blocking of any sort? You actually want to be exposed to all the colors of the rainbow. So there's some very big reasons. It's quite frankly, short of calling it a scam, it is, it's not a good idea, but people making a lot of money on it. And it doesn't actually address the issues. There are some questions as to whether, it might help with eye strain and so forth. And there are some concerns about, and people will talk about blue hazard. Now, again, is once you start labeling something as a blue hazard and you promote it on websites and everything else, it's true that certain colors of blue between about 425 and 450, that's in the sort of royal blue range, certain types of blue at very high intensities, like you get in a sunlight on an Australian beach, right, can cause damage to the macula, to the cells of the eye, can cause cell death in the cells in the eye. But the answer is, indoors, you would never see that level of light ever, because outside an Australian beach, you might have 100,000 lux of light to measure a brightness of light. Indoors, we're rarely much above 100 to 200 to 300 lux of light. In other words, we're something in the order of 1,000 times less bright indoors, and there never is any problem with the so-called blue hazard in that environment. But people sell this blue hazard idea. It's really only, and quite frankly, best thing is put on some dark sunglasses, because that reduces, by 50% or more, your exposure to all the colors if you're out in sunlight. So there's a lot of misinformation out there. Beware the blue hazard. It's not a factor indoors. It's not a damaging thing. It's been used as a political and marketing tool, but it really is not valid, except for the very narrow circumstance of being outdoors in very bright sunlight. And then you can have damage to the eyes coming from that part of the royal blue spectrum.
But just to see, these, so completely red glasses, I'm guessing they block out all of the blue. So
Yes.
480 and everything. Okay, so
Yeah, no,
they're
it's
good
going to
and
do
so.
it. It's going to do your job for you. So be quite clear. You're doing the right thing. In fact, here you are sitting in an environment that is essentially lit by red light with blocking glasses that block out all the blue. you are biologically sitting in the equivalent of darkness. Now, in our caveman ancestors, I mentioned their fires. When they had wood fires, they sat around at night um, and illuminated their homes and their campsites and everything else. Um, they were bathed with a lot of red light because those wood fires, while they had no blue in them, or very, very little blue, have a lot of red. They also have a lot of infrared too. So you're sitting in a light that is actually reminiscent of the generations before electric lights were invented. So that's good. Now, I'm going to raise up another issue because we had then addressed you've chosen to sit in that environment, Jonas. But if I have a workplace at night where I've got to do critical work all night long, I need to have really good visibility for what I'm doing. Then, in fact, the light you're sitting in is perhaps not the right solution. So that was one of the inventions we got to working on, where we said, okay, how could we build a light that looks relatively normal, whitish, yellowish color? In other words, would be good for vision. And how could we do that? And what we discovered, because we had mapped out the sensitivity point, that this sky blue peak around 480, we realized that if we used violet light to whiten the light, if we balanced out the other colors of the spectrum, the greens and the yellows and the reds, and added some violet light into it, we could bring the color of light back into a normal looking range. So those lights are very interesting. And we've installed those in 65 Fortune 500 company workplaces, critical workplaces like oil refinery, control rooms in places like Chevron and Phillips 66 and companies like that. We've installed them in utility companies like Duke Power and others. We've installed them in Europe, in Dow Chemical, in the Netherlands. And when we do that, a number of very interesting things. Number one, we are protecting the melatonin, protecting their light at night. But the light itself is one that is not disrupting their sleep. In fact, they're sleeping better before and after the shift. So we've helped their sleep. We've also shown that light does not cause the diabetic problem and the obesity problem that we talked about earlier. And we've also, very interestingly, found that that violet part of the light spectrum has an alerting effect. Now, we're talking about various effects of light. One of the effects of light is as you get to bluer light, it becomes more alerting. That's one reason people claim that the LED lights would be good working at night. But in fact, because they stimulate the brain more, you're more alert, your cognitive processing is sharper and better, you make fewer errors. But it turns out the violet light is even better than the blue. And now we avoid the problem of circadian disruption because we've removed the blue out of the spectrum, but we've added the violet. And the violet light is something actually that is we're deprived of in our normal LED lights. They don't contain any violet. And we now know that actually violet light is actually rather critical for eye health. For example, children who do not get exposed to violet light get myopia because the violet light actually also stimulates the blood vessels of the eye and keeps the eye healthy. One of the things it does. And children who are indoors and and it's becoming a huge problem in societies where children spend a lot of time indoors. They're not playing outside. They're indoors on their computer screens or doing their homework or whatever it is. And the indoor lighting contains no violet whatsoever, whereas natural light outside, daylight, contains lots of violet and ultraviolet. So what we've done is we've also removed violet light, or the deep violet part of the spectrum, by putting into window glass UVA protection. And it turns out, that blocking the ultraviolet, that sounds like a good thing to do, except particularly at the higher end of the UV, between about 360 and 400 nanometers, that in that area there is no effect in eye damage whatsoever from UV light, and yet the removal of that leads to a growth of myopia. Myopia is climbing at an incredible rate. It was climbing from a quarter of the world's population to projected to be a half of the world's population will have myopia with us in the environment that people are now living in and not seeing the deep violet that's in natural light. So there's a wonderful story here, and as I say, I'd encourage your viewers to look out for The Light Doctor. It's available on Amazon. It's an Amazon bestseller. But what I do is discuss how all these different colors in light are in fact have very important effects on your health. Now, when you go outside in the mornings, as you've told me you do, and I do too, go for a walk outside in the mornings, you get a wonderful dose of all these colors of the rainbow and all their health effects. When you're indoors, we're unfortunately under lighting that doesn't contain the right mix of colors, wavelengths for our health, and under a very artificial lighting, contains no violet at all. And during the evening hours, it has way more blue than we can tolerate. And also it cuts off the infrared. The incandescent light bulbs used to have a lot of infrared in them, and certainly our wood fires in the old age would generate a lot of infrared light. And infrared, by the way, is a form of heat that travels through the body, but it doesn't heat the air. It travels from the source, and then you'll feel warmth from that, but it's not and it's rather like the old days when I grew up. We had fires in the fireplace. We lit the house without central heating, and you got really toasty on one side of you and grew icicles on your backside. That's what infrared light does. Anyway, but we're missing some of these things in our world. So we've created a very artificial, very unhealthy world. We've increased the risk of diabetes and obesity and heart disease and depression and cancers. And what we now know is, in some beautiful studies with very large populations of people, that we also cause shortening of people's healthy lifespan. In other words, people who spend more time outdoors live longer, significantly years longer, than people who live their life mostly indoors. And we know that people who are indoors with the lights on at night, and a surprisingly large number of people are, 40, 50% of the population sleep with some sort of lighting in the bedroom, they are living shorter and having more cardiovascular disease, deaths, and so forth than the people who sleep in pitch dark. So really, we're seeing some very basic rules here. And that, some of the take-home messages I hope everyone can understand is you need a really good dose of natural daylight. Doesn't have to be, it could be a cloudy day, doesn't matter. You've still got a lot of it when you're outside. You need a big dose of that in the morning hours. You need to, when you get to the evening, to have light that's free of blue so that you're not disrupting the circadian clock. You need to sleep in pitch darkness at night with the lights off. So that is really the secret to a long life and a secret to a healthy lifespan. We're concerned not just about how long you live, but how long you live in a healthy state. So these are some pretty big rules we're finding. And, just I think what's fascinating to me about some of these studies, there's a big study actually done in Sweden with 29,000 Swedish women. They were studying the instance, they were concerned about skin cancers, particularly malignant melanomas, in people who spent more time outdoors. And so the study was totally set up for that purpose. And what they found is that the women who spent the most time outdoors had 8 times more skin cancers than the women who spent time mostly indoors. But the women who spent the time outdoors lived years longer. In fact, the effect was as large as the difference between smokers and non-smokers in the population in terms of the size of the effect. So we're really learning some very interesting things about the importance of light.
Amazing. And since you talked about violet light, I wanted to mention that this doctor, Dr. Jack Kruse, to mimic the outside environment, let's say, he puts a UVA lamp. So he doesn't just have red, he has a UVA lamp as well. So he has violet and red, which I find interesting. Maybe I should do that as well. I only have red here. Now we've talked about
Right.
the effects, the biological effects of blue light and also violet light. But of course, the visible light spectrum and also non-visible light spectrum is far bigger than just those two. So if you could talk about the other forms of light, I know that, for example, you've mentioned that if you have a migraine, green light can be good. So the effects of these lights that we haven't discussed would be interesting to go through.
Right, absolutely. So again, another area of research has been to identify to see that in fact the green part of the spectrum, around 550 range in the spectrum, is actually rather effective in a number of ways. It is the color you get from vegetation reflecting color back at you, because when you go outside, the leaves of the trees and the vegetation through photosynthesis are absorbing all the blues and the red part of the spectrum as part of as they do their photosynthetic action, but they're reflecting back the green. And so that's why most things look green, especially during the summer months. Now, it turns out that a walk in the woods, if you take someone, give each a group of people a walk through the woods or the walk down a city street, they are so much more relaxed and feel so much better, and their amygdala is down regulated. The emotional part of the brain involved in stress is down regulated so much more effectively when they're in green light. And it turns out if you in fact treat someone with pure green light and they're someone who has migraines, you can actually reverse migraines and other forms of pain. So again, there's a very interesting analgesic or effect, pain reducing effect of the green part of the spectrum. And what you get when you walk outside, you get a heavy dose of that green, which is why, if you want to calm yourself down, a walk outside is one of the best things you can do in a naturally green lit space. We also talk about other parts of the spectrum up in the red, where in the 650 type range of red, we see a healing of tissue. So post-surgery, if you've got scars, they heal better if they're treated with red light. We see that hair will grow on someone's getting bald. You can reverse that to some extent using red light that in fact stimulates hair growth. So we're just getting into a whole range of understanding now. And as I say in my book, The Light Doctor, I talk about all these different parts of the spectrum and what to be aware of when you're looking at light. And why, as I say, the standard LED, which has no deep red in it, which has no violet in it, um, is really a very unhealthy light, even though it scores highest on the lumens per watt measure. Now, the problem with the regulators, of course, as I've said, they're running away with this idea. They're cranking up the lumens per watt, give an engineer a number, and they're just trying to optimize it. And what they're doing is squeezing out all the healthy light out of our lives just by pure regulation. This is an absolutely devastating thing. And one of the reasons that I founded a campaign for healthy lighting. And anybody interested in that can sign up on our website, circadianlight.org, where you can look at the campaign for healthy lighting. And we've got people all around the world now being locally active and trying to get this word out to regulatory bodies, to healthcare organizations, things like the Diabetes Association or the Cancer Associations, because our biggest problem is a total lack of awareness. The general public doesn't know this yet. They focus tremendously on diet, And one of the, and I'll give you one anecdote. When I was looking at my book, where to publish, and I went to one of the biggest publishing houses in the world called Penguin Random House. I found that they had on their list of books that you could buy on their website 1,600, or actually 1,800 books, all to do with diet and nutrition. They had only one book to do with light and health, and that was published back in 2013 before LED lights came along. So there's a huge education gap. And that's why podcasts such as yours are so important in getting the word out. We've really got to look, and as I'd like to say, the light you see is as important to your health as the food you eat, the fluids you drink, and the air you breathe. It could be argued that it's perhaps even more important than some of those. So it's really a very, very important subject. So I'd encourage everyone to get educated and find the lights that work and understand that the solutions are out there and solutions are available. There are companies in Europe now putting lights that are very low in blue into hospitals and nursing homes, literally 100 hospitals, 100 nursing homes with these types of lighting in now in Europe. But the progress is it's really just getting started on this. Light bulbs are available that are zero blue in content, and you can find more information about that at circadianlight.org, for example. But there are also light bulbs now coming out that are automatically changing depending on the time of day from blue rich light to blue depleted or blue free light, and doing it automatically, which is what we really want to have. We want to have this all automated so we don't have to be thinking about it as to which light bulb you have, that it would just automatically change.
Yes. And one thing I always do with my clients now is they tend to want to discuss nutrition because that's the interesting part. That's the part they always think about. But to me, if I don't make sure that your light environment is perfect first, I don't want to discuss nutrition. Or, of course, I, I will discuss nutrition, but they have to fix their light environment because otherwise the nutrition won't work. Um, let's see here. So speaking of nutrition, I know that there are other things that affect the circadian clock, and I'm guessing the SCN in that case. So for example, eating is one of those things. What are the things that affect the circadian clock?
Well, the most important clue to circadian clocks are the cues that keep us in sync with our environment, and that's the important thing. The most important clues are ones that are the light. That's the most powerful one. Food timing does also have an effect. And so basically, that is a sort of like a second synchronizing cue. So the timing of meals does have an effect. Those are the sort of major ones that really keep the clock synchronized to the outside world. Um, so, but and when we're talking about clocks, we should also say yes. You mentioned the SCN, the master clock in the brain, but there are virtually every tissue in the body and organ in the body has its own circadian clock. There are millions of them. And what matters is keeping them all in sync with each other and in sync with the outside world. So one of the key things is the regularity of your lifestyle. That's one of the most important things here, that you have a regular lifestyle, regular timing, and you strengthen those cues, because the stronger you're robustly synchronized, the bigger the amplitude, the daily changes in your body parameters. You have a real contrast between daytime metabolism and nighttime metabolism. The stronger that contrast is really the secret for a long and healthy life.
Now, speaking of consistency and periodicity, one thing that I've been thinking about, and this is the reason why I want to move to a lower latitude, is because when you look at the higher latitudes like Scandinavia, which have, a lot of mental illnesses within the population, the length of the day varies throughout the year a lot. So let's say you get a big hit of blue light in the morning and you block out all blue light in the evening and your light environment is perfect. Because of the natural light environment, because it varies so much throughout the year, you know, that's probably not going to be very good for consistency. Well, you go down to the equator and the length of the day doesn't vary throughout the year. It varies by like 20 minutes, something like that, but it doesn't vary a lot. So throughout, maybe like throughout a year, that doesn't matter a lot. But throughout, let's say 40, 50 years, having that circadian periodicity of the clock is going to probably be very, very, very significant. So what do you think about that? Do you think that being at lower latitudes is probably a better idea for longevity in that case?
Well, actually, not entirely. It depends. There are limits to this. Um, we are before electricity. It's pretty clear that humans had pretty clear seasonal rhythms. In other words, you also, just like there's a circadian clock, there is in our DNA, and of course, yeah, throughout the animal kingdom, there is yearly cycles. In other words, we are adapted to the seasons of the year in part of our in our bodies. Now, the trouble is, if you get too far north, right, and you are getting fairly far north in terms of um, latitude when you're in Stockholm, when you get to those higher levels, then you're pushing the extremes. It's probably better to be somewhere in between. Um, so moving, yes, moving to somewhat south, but you don't need to go to the equator because there is uh, you can just go to a somewhat lower latitude where the seasonal change is a bit less. But basically humans used to be quite seasonal in terms of their when they had children and the number of births by year by month of year varied quite a lot, for example. Um, and so we know less about these seasonal rhythms. Again, we're protected from them because of our indoor lifestyles. Um, and so we've lost a lot of that natural rhythmicity, but we have a lot of intrinsically natural rhythmicity of our world, the seasonal and the daily, are very much part of our adaptation to nature.
Yes, I think about the poor people who live in Svalbard, for example. Like during the summer, it doesn't get dark. During the winter, it doesn't, they don't have any light. If you look at the chart for when they have daylight and when they have nighttime in Svalbard, I mean, it's insane. And I believe that's the 79th latitude. So I agree with you. Like, you don't have to be at the equator. But what I think is that being below, like, let's say 45, the 45th latitude is probably a pretty good idea. Do you have any closing remarks?
No, I think we should just wrap up now. And but I'm delighted to have this conversation with you. And as I say, I think it's a vitally important subject. Thank you very much.
Thank you.